Hello YouTube, this is Asatsu5. I just got finished watching the UFC fights, and while I was watching these fights, I was thinking to myself about the difference between martial arts and combat sports, martial artist versus athlete, and I was trying to find out a way we can bring more realism to MMA, because clearly martial art is completely different from MMA, even though martial art is in the name MMA, mixed martial arts. But it just somehow doesn't seem like real martial arts. It's like they took the martial out of it, and the art. It's just a brawl, which a brawl isn't necessarily a martial art, but martial is Mars, the god of war. Art is the study of how to dominate your opponent and to end a violent situation as quickly as possible, whether that be in the streets, in a duel, or in a battlefield. And the goal of a martial artist is to not only win, but win quickly so you can move on to the next threat and eliminate it. In martial arts, the intention is either to kill or to disable. Excuse me. It's very difficult to recreate this in a sporting arena, if not impossible. But I'm trying to find out a way how we can put more realism into martial art, and also to get rid of the long, awkward pauses where you get two guys in the clinch for minutes at a time, resting up against a cage and stuff. So this is my ideal to turn MMA into a martial art, a realistic fighting style that can actually help you on the streets. Now, I'm not saying that you can't study MMA and apply it in the streets. I'm not saying you can't study boxing and apply it in the streets. I've seen street fights with American boxers and MMA fighters, and even Aikido, which I don't consider a martial art in the least bit, can help you in the streets. And if it helps you win in a violent encounter, is it a martial art or not? Which can be a completely different subject to talk, or a different video to talk about. Surely, if something helps you end a violent encounter quickly, it is some sort of martial science or art. But Taekwondo. What you see in the Olympics in Taekwondo and what you see in tournaments is completely different than what they teach the black belts to use in the streets. In Taekwondo, they teach you to fight differently in tournaments than how you fight in the streets, which I think is wrong. If it doesn't work in the streets, then they shouldn't teach you to do it in the tournament or at all. And I'll probably talk about that in the other video. But how can we make MMA, the combat sport, more realistic and more exciting? And this comes because I want to make UFC more martially realistic, and I want it to be more entertaining. And this is my thought. I'm kind of thinking out loud, although I pre-thought about this concept, but I'm going to share it with you. What if in MMA, whether it be UFC, Bellator, or any full contact combat sport, you give incentive pay for first round knockouts? Rounds last about 3 minutes, and you have about 2 rounds. You give incentive for someone who knocks out someone first or within the first round, and you deduct payment for judges' decisions. You know, in in combat in the streets or in warfare, there was no judges' decisions. So you penalize the competitors if it comes to a judge's decision. Now, obviously, the person that wins the judge's decision will win more than the fighter who loses, but the fighter who wins decisively gets paid more than he would have if he won by judge's decision. Now, I realize there's some inherent flaws in this that, it'll just be, and this has a lot to do with realistic martial arts as well, but they will just run full force at each other and not use any technique, and they'll just bash, 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 bash. But isn't that kind of what martial art is? Not the random, unstrategic bashing, but martial art should be very decisive. Martial being Mars, the god of war, and the art of that, or the science of that, is how to do it as quickly and decisively and efficiently as possible. So, like in World War II, not World War II, World War I, you're fighting in the trenches. There's a lot of hand-to-hand combat. These fights last seconds. Japanese sword duels last in seconds. There's no big exchange. And there was a possibility if UFC or Bellator was realistic, it won't be quite as entertaining as it is when they have the big exchanges. But I feel if we make these changes, you won't get these long pauses where they're in the clinch and they're resting on each other and they're resting up against the cage. That you get in these stalemates where the the referee has to stand them up and then separate them and then tell them to fight. And sometimes, even tonight, when they're fighting, the referee will say, "Come on, go, 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 fight, 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 do something," which to me is ridiculous. Also, I think it's ridiculous when you hear the sticks clap, the 10-second warning in the end of the round, that if there's not a clear winner, that the fighters really don't do anything. I think if you hear the clap, clap with the sticks, 10-second warning, I think that should be your cue to give it all you have in those last 10 seconds to end the match, whether it be a submission or a knockout. I don't know if you can submit. You can submit someone quicker, faster than 10 seconds. I know that is possible if you execute it correctly, but it's very difficult to execute correctly. But I feel if we get rid of these long pauses, the lack of the aggression, if we up the aggression and make it more of a martial sport and not a combat sport, I know that's kind of counterintuitive, but if we make it more street realistic, still safety rules, no growing or eye gouging or anything like that, but you give them motivation to end the fight as quickly as possible, I feel we'll have a much more exciting match and a much more realistic representation of what you to expect on the street. The conversation of what is a martial art and what is a combat sport and what a martial artist is and what an athlete is can get very blurry, very foggy, very confusing. Sorry, I tried from this video several times, so I don't know if I'm repeating myself, but I'm not saying that MMA, boxing, Taekwondo can't help you in the streets, but if you're in a competitive arena and you're not fighting like you would fight in the streets, you're staring each other down, you're I guess it's kind of like modern sport fencing versus HEMA, and HEMA's trying to make fencing more realistic. And that's what I'm trying to do with MMA and boxing and taekwondo. I want to make it more realistic, more exciting, and that's kind of the point I'm trying to make. I know I'm rambling, but to recap, in order to make a combat sport more of a martial art, still in an arena format, I think we need to give incentive pay for first round knockouts and decisive wins, and deduct pay for judges' decisions, and to have no less than 2 rounds, no more than 3 rounds, just a few minutes, and get it done, and encourage these fighters to be aggressive, because that's something that I see in MMA is a lack of aggression. They're not fighting like their life depends on it. I know they're enjoying the match, but it's not realistic in my opinion. And I'm not saying that my sparring sessions were realistic when I was in Taekwondo, or back when I had a martial arts club, an amateur martial arts club, basically my friends meeting up and us practicing on them. I'm not saying that I'm more realistic than them, because I want a safe training environment. But you can have a safe and training environment, but have a realistic competition, and still be relatively safe. I mean, they're wearing gloves, they're wearing mouth guards. I just want to encourage them to hit more and bind less, if that makes sense. Quit binding your time and just go for it. And I want to end the video there. Tell me what you think. Would this be a good thing for UFC, Bellator, boxing, Taekwondo, and or do you think this will ruin the sport? By the way, I think UFC is really hurting right now, far as their lineups. You don't got Rousey anymore, and she was a big crowd draw. You don't have Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva still fights, but he's kind of broken. I missed his last fight, so I don't know how well he did. But ever since he lost that first match in UFC, he couldn't step back in the ring and dominate like he used to. And then he broke his leg. And then, they were giving him pay-per-views, and he was losing these pay-per-views very consistently. So he's kind of broken. And then you got McGregor, and he just fought Floyd Mayweather. He won a whole lot of money, so he might not have the motivation to continue fighting and drawing in people to the UFC. I mean, I like to think that he enjoys UFC and he'll continue to do it, but I haven't heard any news on him lately, and UFC just doesn't have the crowd drawers like they used to. And I've noticed this at Buffalo Wild Wings. The crowds are not as big. There were a few times where they said, hey, if you have X amount of people at your table, your check has to equal this much, because they're really struggling to make the money to pay off the pay-per-view that they're showing for free. And so that's what I was thinking of when I was watching UFC. How can I make it more realistic, and how can I make it more exciting? That's it. I'm Asatsu5, and I'm out.